The year was Frank Sinatra was at a party in the Hollywood Hills, the kind of party where the guest list was a map of American power, and everyone in the room knew exactly where they stood on it. He had a drink in his hand, a circle of men around him, and the particular confidence of someone who had decided long ago that his opinions were facts. At some point during the evening, someone mentioned Natalie Wood. She was 13 years old. She had been in films for nearly a decade. She was already one of the most recognizable young actresses in the country, and the studios were already debating what she would become when the child roles ran out. Sinatra listened, then he said what he thought. She won't last. Pretty kid. Sure, but this business chews through pretty kids. She's a studio product, nothing more. Give it 5 years and nobody will remember her name. The men around him nodded. Sinatra was not a man whose assessments were openly questioned, especially not in 1952, and especially not at a party in the Hollywood Hills where disagreeing with Frank Sinatra had professional consequences that could last years. 10 years later, in 1962, Natalie Wood had just appeared on the cover of Life magazine for the third time. She had two Academy Award nominations. She had starred in two of the most commercially successful films of the decade. She was, by virtually every available measure, one of the biggest stars in the world. And Frank Sinatra said nothing. Not publicly, not privately, not to the men who had been in that circle in 1952 and who are now in different circles in different rooms, carrying the memory of what he had said and watching what it had failed to predict. He said nothing because there was nothing to say. The woman he had dismissed at 13 had done the one thing his world was least prepared for. She had proved him wrong. If you want the stories Hollywood tried to bury forever, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the truth that powerful people spent decades hiding. Context. To understand what Frank Sinatra said in 1952, you have to understand what Hollywood believes about child stars. The conventional wisdom was not complicated. It was brutal in its simplicity and accurate, often enough to feel like a law of nature. Child stars burned bright and vanished. Discovered young, exploited while their novelty held. Discarded when the public moved on. The history of Hollywood was littered with their names. Shirley Temple, the most beloved child star in American history, was retired from films at 21 because the audience that had adored her at 6 could not be persuaded to feel the same way about her as a woman. The list was long, and the pattern was consistent, and by 1952 it was so well established that a man like Sinatra could reference it with the casual authority of someone citing historical record. Natalie Wood had been in film since 1943, placed there by her mother Maria Gurdin, a Russian immigrant whose ambitions were as consuming as any plan Sinatra had ever made for himself. The studios understood Natalie the way they understood everything as a commodity. She was bankable, photographed beautifully, did what she was told, in every professional sense, exactly what the studio system wanted. What the studio system did not account for, what Frank Sinatra did not account for, was what Natalie was doing when the cameras were not on her. She was reading, studying, paying attention in the specific way that people pay attention when they understand that the room they are sitting in is not the room they intend to remain in forever. She was building something in private that had no name yet in 1952 but would become unmistakable by 1962. She was building a career on her own terms, inside a system designed to prevent exactly that. The moment the party in the Hollywood Hills in 1952 was not unusual. These gatherings happened constantly. Informal assemblies of the industry's power brokers at private homes where the real business of Hollywood was conducted between drinks, while official business happened in studio offices during the day. Frank Sinatra was in a complicated moment of his own in 19. His recording career had stalled. His marriage to Ava Gardner was turbulent. His film work had not produced the serious roles he believed he deserved. He was not yet at his peak. That would come with From Here to Eternity the following year, but he carried himself with the authority of a man who considered any setback temporary and any doubter a fool. His opinions were not offered as contributions to conversation, they were delivered as conclusions, and when Natalie Wood's name came up that night, he offered his conclusion. She won't last. Pretty kid? Sure. But this business chews through pretty kids. Remove the machinery, the careful casting, the studio publicity, the professional lighting, and what's left? Nothing that survives the transition from child roles to adult ones. The industry is full of beautiful women. It doesn't need another one badly enough to forgive the absence of real talent. She won't last 5 years. Then he moved on to another subject. The assessment had been delivered. There was nothing left to say. The decade What happened in the decade between 1952 and 1962 was not an accident. It looked like one from the outside, the natural unfolding of a career that had found its footing, the ordinary trajectory of a talented person rising through an industry that had finally recognized what it had. But from the inside, from the perspective of the people who watched it happen, it was something considerably more deliberate than that. In 1955, Elia Kazan cast Natalie Wood in Rebel Without a Cause alongside James Dean. The casting was not obvious. Natalie was 16 and had spent her entire career in the careful, controlled performances that studio era child acting required. Performances calibrated for likability and audience comfort rather than emotional truth. Kazan wanted something different. He wanted real. He wanted the kind of work that came from somewhere underneath the performance, from a place most actors spent their careers trying to find and never did. He found it in Natalie Wood. What came out of her in that film was not what the studio had manufactured. It was not what Maria Gurdon had engineered. It was not what Frank Sinatra's assessment of her potential had allowed for. It was specific and raw and emotionally precise in the way that the best screen acting is precise. The kind of work where the actor is not performing an emotion but living inside it, and the camera's job is simply to record what is already there. The film was a sensation. Natalie received her first Academy Award nomination at 17. The industry took note, not all of it and not immediately. The assumptions embedded in how the studios thought about young actresses were too deeply entrenched to be overturned by a single performance, however remarkable. But the conversation about Natalie Wood shifted. The question was no longer whether she would survive the transition from child roles, the question was what she was capable of. She answered that question in 1961 with Splendor in the Grass, directed again by Kazan, in a performance that many critics would later describe as the finest of her career. A portrayal of psychological collapse and buried desire that required her to access emotional registers most actresses twice her age had never found. The film earned her a second Academy Award nomination. It established her definitively and without serious debate as one of the most gifted dramatic actresses of her generation. Then came West Side Story. The film was released in October 1961 to the kind of reception that happens once or twice in a decade, a cultural event rather than a movie release, a work that the public and the critics recognized simultaneously as something that would last. It won 10 Academy Awards. It became one of the most commercially successful films in the history of the studio system. And at its center, in the role of Maria, was Natalie Wood, 23 years old, a decade past the moment Frank Sinatra had said she wouldn't last 5 years, delivering a performance that would be watched and studied and celebrated for the rest of the century. The silence Frank Sinatra in 1962 was at a different kind of peak than he had occupied in 19. The intervening decade had been extraordinary. From Here to Eternity had revived his film career in 1953 and won him an Academy Award. The Capitol Records years had produced some of the finest popular music of the 20th century. The Rat Pack had made him the gravitational center of American entertainment culture. He was, by 1962, one of the most powerful men in Hollywood in ways that 1952 Sinatra had only aspired to be. He was also a man with a precise and documented memory for the assessments he had made about people. He kept track of who had proven him right and who had proven him wrong with the same intensity he brought to everything else. Being wrong was not something Frank Sinatra processed easily or graciously. It sat with him, became part of a private accounting that he conducted constantly and that shaped how he moved through rooms and how he treated people and what he said about them when their names came up in conversation. Natalie Wood's name came up in conversation frequently in 19. It was impossible for it not to. She was on the cover of magazines. She was the subject of profiles in every major publication. Her films were in theaters, and her name was in the mouths of everyone who followed Hollywood, which in 1962 was essentially everyone in America. The men who had been in the circle at the party in 1952 were still in Sinatra's orbit in 1962. These things persist in Hollywood. The social architecture of the industry is remarkably stable. The same people move through the same rooms across decades, carrying with them the accumulated memory of conversations that were never meant to be remembered this long. Some of them waited for Sinatra to address what he had said. He never did, not in private conversations, not in the interviews he gave, which were numerous, in which he was characteristically direct about his opinions of films and performances and the people behind them, not in the presence of the men who had heard him in 1952 and who had spent the intervening decade watching what actually happened. He said nothing, which was, for Frank Sinatra, the loudest possible response. The witnesses, the men who had been at the party in 1952, were not a monolithic group. They had different relationships with Sinatra, different levels of investment in his social world, different thresholds for what they were willing to say out loud about someone they needed to stay on the right side of, but they talked among themselves in the way that Hollywood has always talked, carefully, in the specific language of an industry where information is currency and the wrong word in the wrong place can close doors that take years to reopen. They talked about what Sinatra had said in 1952 and what had happened in the decade since, and the way they talked about it revealed something about the culture of those rooms that a more direct kind of conversation never would have. They were not surprised that Sinatra was wrong. They had seen him be wrong before, about performers, and about films, and about the direction the industry was moving, and his certainty had never been proportional to his accuracy. What surprised them was the scale of it, the specific and total nature of the failure of his prediction. He had not merely underestimated Natalie Wood, he had described a trajectory that was the precise inverse of what actually occurred. He had said she would be forgotten. She was on the cover of Life magazine. He had said the machinery was doing the work. The machinery had nothing to do with Rebel Without a Cause or Splendor in the Grass. Those performances came from somewhere the machinery could not reach and could not manufacture. He had said she was a studio product. She was, by 1962, one of the few actors of her generation who had begun to exert genuine creative control over her own work, fighting for roles, challenging directors, developing a professional seriousness that the studios accommodated because they had no choice. One producer who had been present at the party in 1952 and who was still active in Hollywood a decade later described the dynamic to a journalist in the late 1970s. He said that by 1962, Natalie Wood's name had become a kind of shorthand in certain rooms, a reference point that people used when they wanted to make a point about the limits of assuming you understood what a person was capable of based on where they had started. He said that nobody used Frank Sinatra's name in the same sentence. They didn't have to. The weight of 10 years, what Frank Sinatra had not accounted for in 1952, what men in rooms like that would rarely account for, was the specific kind of determination that develops in a person who has been underestimated for so long that the underestimation becomes fuel. Natalie Wood had been underestimated her entire life by the studios that cast her in roles designed to exploit her likability rather than develop her craft, by the directors who told her where to stand and what to feel rather than asking what she had found, by the men at parties who discussed her career in terms of prettiness and marketability and commercial potential rather than in the terms one might use for a person with genuine artistic ambition. She had heard all of it. Every assessment, every assumption, every casual dismissal delivered in the confident tone of someone who had decided they already knew what she was, and she had used it. Not consciously, perhaps, or not only consciously, talent of that order doesn't operate entirely from intention. But the decade between 1952 and 1962 was shaped in part by the accumulated weight of everything that had been assumed about her and everything she had decided to demonstrate was wrong. The work ethic that colleagues described as extraordinary, the intellectual seriousness that surprised everyone who encountered it, the refusal to accept the roles the studios considered appropriate for her, and the insistence on pursuing the roles that would require something real. All of it pointed in the same direction, toward the cover of Life magazine, toward a second Academy Award nomination, toward West Side Story and the 10 Oscars it won, and the audience of millions who watched it and understood immediately that the woman at its center was not a pretty face who had survived on good bone structure and studio machinery, toward the silence of Frank Sinatra in 1962, which was worth more than anything he might have said. Final reflection: Frank Sinatra was wrong about a great many things over the course of a long and complicated life. He was wrong about people and about films and about the direction of American culture, and he was wrong in ways that he sometimes acknowledged and sometimes buried and sometimes simply outlasted by moving on to the next opinion before anyone could make him answer for the previous one. But the assessment he delivered in 1952 about a 13-year-old girl who he had decided was a studio product was no future, was wrong in a particular way. It was wrong with the specific and total wrongness of a man who had looked at a person and seen only what was visible on the surface, the machinery, the studio management, the external apparatus of a career being built around her, and had not looked for what was underneath. What was underneath was everything. A discipline that she had been building since she was old enough to understand what she was doing. An emotional intelligence that could not be manufactured or managed or lit by a professional cinematographer. a determination that the decade between 1952 and 1962 had not weakened but concentrated, refined into something that came out on screen as pure, undeniable truth. Frank Sinatra understood performance. He had spent his entire life in it, had built one of the most celebrated careers in American entertainment on his ability to make an audience believe that what they were hearing was real. He understood better than most what it cost to make something that true. He understood it well enough to recognize it when he saw it, which is perhaps why in 1962, when Natalie Wood's name was everywhere and the evidence of what she had become was impossible to avoid or argue with, Frank Sinatra said nothing. Because there are moments when a man who has spent his life being certain encounters something that certainty cannot account for. And the only honest response to that is silence. Frank Sinatra said Natalie Wood would never last in Hollywood. He said it in 1952 in a room full of people who were listening. He was silent in 1962 in a world that remembered what he had said. And Natalie Wood, who had heard assessments like his her entire life, who had used every one of them, who had turned the accumulated weight of being underestimated into the most precisely calibrated fuel, kept working, as if she had never needed his approval, because she never had.